Today's scripture passage is Mark 15, verses 1 through 20. You're invited to turn there in your own Bible or follow along behind me on the screen. Very early in the morning, the chief priests, with the elders, the teachers of the law, and the whole Sanhedrin, made their plans. So they bound Jesus, led him away, and handed him over to Pilate. "Are you the king of the Jews?" asked Pilate. "You have said so," Jesus replied. The chief priests accused him of many things. So again, Pilate asked him, "Aren't you going to answer? See how many things they are accusing you of?" But Jesus still made no reply, and Pilate was amazed. Now it was the custom at the festival to release a prisoner whom the people requested. A man called Barabbas was in prison with the insurrectionists who had committed murder in the uprising. The crowd came up and asked Pilate to do for them what he usually did. "Do you want me to release to you the king of the Jews?" asked Pilate, knowing it was out of self-interest that the chief priests had handed Jesus over to him. But the chief priests stirred up the crowd to have Pilate release Barabbas instead. "What shall I do then with the one you call the king of the Jews?" Pilate asked them. "Crucify him," they shouted. "Why? What crime has he committed?" asked Pilate. But they shouted all the louder, "Crucify him." Wanting to satisfy the crowd, Pilate released Barabbas to them. He had Jesus flogged and handed him over to be crucified. The soldiers led Jesus away into the palace, that is the praetorium, and called together the whole company of soldiers. They put a purple robe on him. Then they twisted together a crown of thorns and set it on him. And they began to call out to him, "Hail, King of the Jews!" Again and again they struck him on the head with a staff, and they spit on him. Falling on their knees, they paid homage to him. And when they had mocked him, they took off the purple robe and put his own clothes on him. Then they led him out to crucify him. This is God's word.
When is it that you think people are at their worst? When are people most likely sort of lose it and spew all kinds of venom and foulness? Most likely it comes when people are under the greatest pressure. They're tired, they're weary, they're exhausted, they haven't eaten well. They're being mistreated perpetually, and it grinds on them. I ask that because today's passage shows us Jesus in a situation where the heat is turned up as high as it will go, to a level which you and I are not going to experience. Typically, when we think of divine power, we tend to think in terms of overwhelming and irresistible force. But as I watch Jesus' passion unfold, and the word passion, I remind you, comes from a word which means to suffer. When we watch Jesus' passion, I am struck by a different manifestation of divine power. It's more like what I might call divine restraint. Watching Jesus in this crucible of his suffering, and we've been watching him in this since we found him in the garden, just hours before this event, but which has taken us weeks to unfold in terms of our discussion of it. We find Jesus' character and divine power, and we see it through a different lens. Don't get me wrong, while it's wonderful and it's amazing to watch Jesus doing things like controlling weather systems and exercising authority over demons that are terrorizing people's lives, and we watch him giving sight to people who are born blind and raising people who have been rotting in a tomb for days, while those extraordinary shows of power and authority are astonishing, it's quite another thing to see the way divine power looks when divine power is enduring abuse and unfair and unjust suffering. Now, a favorite verse among Christians is found in Hebrews chapter 4, and you'll recognize the verse. We refer to it from time to time. And it says this, "For we do not have a high priest who's unable to empathize with our weaknesses." Now, that's good news, isn't it? But there's more. We don't have a high priest who's unable to empathize with our weaknesses, but we have one who has been tempted in every way, just as we are, yet he did not sin. Well, one of the ways Jesus was tempted and tested, and it's not one of the ways you typically think of, was this test of being subjected to false accusation. How would he respond? Being subjected to unfair and unjust treatment. Some of you have gotten kind of used to that. We watch Jesus tested and tempted to erupt with foulness or other unsightly things as he is being unjustly treated, but he does not. Now, one of the things I cannot help but notice in this passage is the way Jesus does not respond to false accusations, unjust and unfair and even illegal treatment. He did not respond, first of all, with self-defense before his accusers, which is noteworthy. And we'll talk a little bit more about that later, why that could have been and what might that mean and what might we learn from that. But he doesn't respond with self-defense before his accusers. He doesn't respond with destructive, dehumanizing verbal retaliation, which is all around us in our world today at the highest levels. He doesn't respond in kind. Additionally, he does not respond by complaining of unfairness to his heavenly Father, which you and I are prone to do. And he also does not merely acquiesce to the pressure to change who he is and what he's doing. He stays the course. Now, those are really striking behaviors. The character of Jesus is magnificent to watch in this crucible. Now, Mark, as we have made note of many times as we've been going through this gospel, and we're nearing the end now, Mark is one who is very frequently short on words, short on descriptions. He doesn't add a whole lot of extraneous stuff, typically. And in keeping with Mark's modus operandi here, he actually pares down and gives us an abbreviated form of what was actually a multi-phase proceeding which Jesus endured. And in that proceeding, Jesus has been humiliatingly dragged back and forth between multiple persons, each of whom is sitting in a different seat of authority. Mark 14 tells us that Jesus has already been interrogated by the high priest and then the entire Sanhedrin. This was during the wee small hours of what you might call the night or the morning, between 1 and 3 a.m. And now early that very same morning, he is taken before a state magistrate. Now, the first phase of this trial you might call Jesus' ecclesiastical interrogation, because he's being tried on religious matters by religious people. So we could call that an ecclesiastical interrogation. Now he's brought before a state, a government official, and it's on secular terms. We could call this his, what's the word for it? We'll just call it a non-religious trial, a civil. That's the word I'm looking for. You're right, Sal. A civil trial, a civil interrogation. I should always listen to Sal, and you should always listen to Sal. Not always. Ask his wife. Now, what's interesting is that during the first phase, this ecclesiastical interrogation of Jesus before the chief priests and the whole Sanhedrin, do you remember how he was treated? He was falsely accused. He was unfairly and illegally tried. He was insulted. He was spat upon. He was physically abused. He was physically beaten at the hands of the religious paragons of the day. Now, in today's passage, we find Jesus being taken before the state authorities for a civil trial. Now, it struck out to me that they bound Jesus in order to take him before Pilate. And I thought, seriously? He needs to be, he's a flight risk. Hasn't he already proved that? You see what I'm saying? And yet they humiliatingly bind him as a criminal and drag him from one place of meeting to another, bound like a criminal, and the sun is barely up. And he submits to this treatment. He doesn't lose it. He doesn't blow a gasket. He submits to the treatment. And he's taken before a man named Pilate. Now, Pilate, we need to talk about for a few minutes because he's such an integral part of what transpires here. What transpires. Who was Pilate? I'm going to put a picture of his bust up there so you can see what historians think he might have looked like. This is a bust of Pontius Pilate. Who was he and what were the pressures he faced? Pilate obviously is a man who's been much scrutinized over centuries for his role in this particular scenario. He hasn't been so scrutinized for other things that he did, but there is some historical documentation of his life and his work, which we'll allude to shortly. His is a name that lives on in infamy, much like that of Judas Iscariot, because of his role in this scenario. I cannot deny that most of my life I've kind of had a little bit of a soft spot for Pilate. Anybody else? If you feel a little bit for Pilate, okay. A few of you feel a little bit for Pilate. I don't let him off the hook, but I can understand to some degree. So I've always felt like Pilate was a man who was stuck in an impossible position, or as close to impossible as you might be inclined to experience. Why do I say that? Well, Palestine was a powder keg. There are spots in the world today that you would consider a powder keg, and you're just waiting for something to ignite the thing, and it's just going to blow. Well, Palestine was that way in the Roman era. Palestine was like a powder keg waiting to be touched off at any moment. The Romans were the overlords as they controlled much of the world at the time. But the Jews of Palestine resented Rome fiercely. And that's not necessarily any reflection on who the Romans were. It's more a reflection on who the Jews had been and continued to be. And I have to tell you, there was never a more principled, highly sensitive, touchy, stubborn, unwieldy people group to govern than the Palestinian Jews at this time. Now, as a Roman administrator, as a Roman government official in the first century AD, if you were going to be given a procuratorship or a governorship somewhere in the Roman-dominated world, the region of Judea is the last place on the planet that you would want to be sent, but this is where Pilate found himself. And some historians believe that this was almost like a last chance opportunity for Pilate to redeem himself and to establish a career because it hadn't gone so well previously. Now, not all historians think that that's true, but some think that that is true. Now, Pilate, and this I take largely from the historical writings of Josephus, who was a Jewish man, but he was a Roman sympathizer during the era. Pilate himself seems to have been rather disinclined to put up with a bunch of whiny, touchy minorities with ridiculously over-the-top religious scruples who did not want to be governed. So if you're not really inclined to cater to that, how might you respond to it? Well, Josephus records that Pilate's style was pretty much to shove Romishness down the throats and force compliance among the Jewish people, whether they liked it or not. And it didn't go well. Pilate had gotten himself into hot water with Tiberius Caesar right off the bat for such foolish ways of dealing with the Jews of Palestine. Because rather than keeping peace in the region, what had Pilate done? He'd been poking the sleeping bear. He'd spawned massive resentment and resistance in Palestine from among the Jewish people. So there was a huge Jewish outcry to Rome about the behavior of this man who'd been sent to be their procurator. And Caesar was not happy with Pilate, the record shows, and had rebuked him for his foolish ways of handling these troublesome people in this powder keg spot on the globe. In essence, and these are my words to describe what I have read, Pilate had been told by Tiberius Caesar, look, you better find a way to work with these people and keep things calm there in Palestine and Judea, or your career's over, bud. You're toast. This is your last chance. Figure it out. Now, most people know that the Jews of Jesus' day did not have legal authority to exercise capital punishment, at least not in terms of a controlled, thought-out practice. We see incidents where the mob sort of riots and does it anyway, like with Stephen. And if you read Acts chapter 7 and chapter 8, you can see this. But this is kind of mob action. The Jews they didn't have the authority to put a man on trial or put a woman on trial and then, in a judicial, cool, collected, thought-out way, execute the person without the approval of the procurator, the governor. And of course, how did they feel about that? They resented that. Now, Pilate then is faced with this tough balancing act. Here's how to describe it. How do I keep a modicum of Roman order here without setting off the powder keg of full-blown insurrection from these proud, stubborn, ungovernable people? Now, what's interesting, Pilate doesn't want to set off a riot. Neither do the Jews, but they are fearing this for different reasons. The Jewish people are well aware of the fact that Jesus has a significant following, and particularly at this time because it's Passover season. And many are acclaiming the messiahship of Jesus. So they are afraid that if they don't do this in the right way, with Pilate's approval and even Pilate being the agent, that they could touch off their own riot, their own people will riot, and Rome will be forced to come with an extremely heavy hand and just make the people miserable, wiping out people with lots of unnecessary bloodshed. So they're both concerned about touching this off and having it explode, but for different reasons. Now, the Sanhedrin, which is the governing body of Jews in the region at the time, who has already tried Jesus illegally and come up with a theological charge against him, they are smart enough to know that blasphemy is not going to be a charge that will hold any water with a government official. Pilate doesn't give a rip who calls himself God at this point. He knows that that is a matter for you guys to quibble about in-house. So he doesn't care. So they know that if they're going to get what they want from Pilate, they're going to have to frame their charges in such a way that Pilate will be convinced that there are interests for Rome involved in this, that Jesus is a threat to Rome. And so they scramble and they figure and they plan, how can we frame the case in these terms? Now, Mark in his brevity doesn't give you what I'm about to read for you. This comes from Luke, who does give you this insight. Luke, in his account of this trial, tells us this, Luke 23, verse 2. And they, that would be the Sanhedrin, began to accuse him, that would be Jesus, in front of Pilate. If you read the whole section, they began to accuse Jesus in front of Pilate, saying, we have found this man subverting our nation. He opposes payment of taxes to Caesar and claims to be Messiah, a king. Now, if you were to do the work of perusing all four gospel accounts of the trials of Jesus and try to synthesize it, you might wind up, like me, with threefold charges brought by the Jewish nation against Jesus in his civil trial. They amount, in my mind, to these. First of all, Jesus was fomenting sedition, or so they wanted Pilate to believe. Now, which is interesting because it's such a mischaracterization. Fomenting civil and national sedition was the furthest thing from Jesus' mind, and it was the furthest thing from the character of the way he behaved. And I present to you as evidence the fact that he continually refused to accept the mantle of kingship that the crowds were trying to force upon him. He was not interested in fomenting sedition from Rome. Nonetheless, they bring that as a false charge against him in his civil trial. Secondly, they accused Jesus before Pilate of forbidding the paying of taxes to Caesar, which is a deliberate fabrication, because it wasn't more than 4 or 5 days earlier that Jesus is tested by a man who comes up in front of a crowd of people and asks Jesus, "Is it right for we Jews to pay taxes to Caesar?" You remember what Jesus said? Whose image is on the coin? Caesar's. And Jesus says, then give to Caesar what belongs to Caesar, and give to God what belongs to God. Which basically he was talking about civil taxes. Pay taxes to Caesar. Nonetheless, the religious people go to Pilate and says, he's telling our people to stop paying taxes to you guys. And thirdly, the third charge they level against Jesus, and by the way, the second two are sort of outgrowths of the first. They accuse him of claiming to be a king and thus a rival to Caesar. When even a cursory survey of Jesus' behavior and teaching makes it clear that earthly kingship is not at all on Jesus' agenda. Now, the irony here strikes me, and you're going to see a lot of irony as we go through this today. Here's the irony. These Jewish leaders who are accusing Jesus of claiming to be a king, they actually do want a Messiah to come and kick some Roman hiney. But here they are saying, he's claiming to be a king, and we have no king but Caesar. What a lie! What a lie! But they pin this on Jesus. Now, I want you guys to be remembering the false accusations, the mistreatment, the unjustness, the unfairness, and how Jesus responds to it all. Because you deal with unfairness in your life. You deal with mistreatment. You deal with injustice in your life. Watch your Lord and your Master and see what you might be able to learn. Now, there is more irony in here. First of all, it's this. Remember that the Sanhedrin was rushing to get Pilate to kill Jesus very early on Friday. Remember, this is just about sunup. They've already conducted their own wee small hour trial. And then they bring Jesus to Pilate probably about the time the sun is coming up, because this is the time when these things were done. And they're trying to rush this process through. Why did they want this done early on Friday? Does anybody remember? So that they could observe what? Passover. Well, of course, first of all, it's going to be a Sabbath. Sabbath begins at sundown. Okay? And this is a special Sabbath. This is the first Passover Sabbath, the first Sabbath of Passover. And they want to be free to practice their religion. And so they dishonestly, illegally try to kill God while keeping scrupulously their religious observances. Do you not see the irony? What's wrong with this picture? And you begin to realize the magnitude of what's happening here, and you realize why God needs to rescue us. This is who we are. And this is exactly why Jesus has come. Because we're this bad. Not just them. We are this misled. We are this thick. We are this rebellious. There's another irony here. We are told in the gospel accounts that the Jews, the Sanhedrin, the Jewish leaders, would not enter Pilate's palace. Why? because they didn't want to be ceremonially defiled so that they could not observe their Sabbath and Passover rituals. Now, in response to these charges, Pilate begins to question Jesus. And this is verse 2 of Mark 15. "Are you the king of the Jews?" asked Pilate. "You've said so," replied Jesus. And again, I don't know how to inflect that. "You've said so," or "You said so." I don't know. I'm not exactly sure what Jesus meant. But I know this. Have you ever noticed how two people can think they're talking about the same thing and become talking about things that are completely different? Well, it occurred to me, could the difference between Pilate's meaning of kingship and Jesus' view of kingship have been any further apart? No. And some scholars, when they look at this strange response from Jesus, at least it seems strange to me, and I think most people agree that it's kind of, I don't know how to take that response. Some scholars believe that Jesus' strange answer is a way of saying to Pilate, we both know that your idea and my idea of kingship are nothing alike, so this charge isn't going to wash. You've said so. So Pilate continues to question Jesus, and the desperate religious leaders of the Jews continue to pile on the charges. Mark 15, 3 through 5. The chief priests accused him of many things. So again, Pilate asked him, aren't you going to answer? See how many things they're accusing you of? And I think Pilate is actually a little bit like, you got to be kidding me. Come on. See how many things they're accusing you of? I don't even think he buys any of it. You're not going to answer? I think he wants Jesus to speak up for himself. Jesus still made no reply. Read the next words. Why? Why would Pilate be amazed that Jesus made no response? Jesus' silence before Pilate here stands out prominently to me. He makes no attempts to defend himself. And I ask myself, what's that about? Frankly, I struggle to know. But I will share some thoughts that I've had on it. And don't take them as their gospel themselves. These are my struggling thoughts to figure out why Jesus may have remained silent here. First of all, the idea of self-defense. Doesn't the idea of self-defense come from a place within us of wanting to rescue ourselves from a situation? Or at least our reputations from some kind of harm? And I think the answer is yes. It could be from physical harm. It could be from somebody's bad opinion of us. We want to rescue ourselves, our reputations from this. Well, remember, Jesus has no designs whatsoever of getting out of this situation. This was his hour. This was the cup that the Father has given him to drink. He was, as I've remarked before, according to another New Testament author, the Lamb slain from before the foundation of the world. It was for this that he had come. He's not trying to get out of anything. That's the first thing that comes to my mind as I think about Jesus' silence and no self-defense. Secondly, I think about this. I think Jesus' silence in the face of his false accusers shows an amazing peace that is grounded in the fact that his integrity is sound. His integrity is sound. And it's grounded in the fact that he is resting in his Father's hand. Here is the spotless Lamb of God giving his life into the hands of those who are not spotless and perfect, but he's doing so in accordance with his Father's will. So there's no need to try to save himself from this. He trusts the cup that the Father has given him to drink, even though he has wrestled with it. Now, a third thing I think about when I see the silence of Jesus, the fact that he doesn't respond in the ways that you and I would respond, is this. When we calmly, serenely refuse to defend ourselves against false accusations, is there an impact of that? Doesn't it tend to make those who are bringing false accusations, doesn't it make them a little unsure of themselves? Doesn't it make them a little bit convicted? To me, it felt similar to what the Proverbs describes as heaping burning coals upon their heads. And I'm not saying that it's done in a manner to rub it in, but I'm just saying integrity wins the day, even if it may lose its life. I thought, what about those who are looking on, watching, like Pilate and anybody else who's in the room? Who is it that comes out looking better, and who comes out looking worse? The people who are bringing dubious accusations, or the person who refuses to dignify the charges with a defense? Now, I say this because I've learned one thing. Sometimes when you guys are falsely accused or maligned or slandered, there's not anything you can do about it. You can't control it. People will do it. But I've learned that often what happens is our lives are going to have to speak for themselves when it all comes down to it. I've learned that what often happens is that over time, the spreader of false accusations becomes known for what he or she is, a spreader of false accusations, an untrustworthy gossip, a person of low character who loves to stir up trouble and tear other people's lives down. And the false accusation then carries no weight. Now, there's a fourth thing that I think about when I think of Jesus' silence before his accusers. Some folks are convinced that Jesus does this simply to fulfill Old Testament prophecy. Isaiah 53, verse 7, written 700 years before that moment, says, "He was oppressed and afflicted, yet he did not open his mouth. He was led like a lamb to the slaughter, and as a sheep before its shearers is silent, so he did not open his mouth." Now, we have seen that Christ deliberately makes behavioral choices and makes word choices as if to say, you see all these prophecies? You're looking at them. You're looking at the fulfillment. And some people think that Jesus keeps his mouth entirely shut at this moment in order to fulfill this prophecy. Say, look, here I am. Now, either way, it's significant that he remains silent and does not open his mouth. Now, in his own defense, he doesn't do it. Now, I will say one thing. It is certainly unusual for a person in that situation not to speak up in many of the ways that you and I would. It's unusual, and Pilate probably has never seen this before. Pilate's a Roman procurator, a governor. People, when they are put on trial, come before Pilate. How many people has he seen grovel on the floor, saying anything, begging for their lives? And then Jesus stands there, and we read a passage, I had you read the words out loud, that said, Pilate was amazed. Such silence, says William L. Lane, was wholly unusual in the forum, and it demonstrated a presence and a dignity which puzzled the prefect. Now, zooming back out, while the holy men of Israel are trying to force Pilate's hand into crucifying Jesus, it soon becomes clear that Pilate is not buying any of it. He recognizes that the charges are bogus and that they're coming from a foul place in the hearts of Judaism's leaders. Even though he's not pristine himself, he recognizes what's going on here. But at the same time, he's under great pressure to keep the calm of Palestine. And so he begins trying to find a way to avoid executing Jesus while still keeping peace. So he tries something. And what's interesting is that there is a modern-day parallel. When a president is about to leave office, what is one of the last symbolic acts that he does? A presidential pardon of somebody who has been incarcerated, somebody who has been condemned as a criminal. And it's largely symbolic. Is it not? Well, you've got something similar going on here. We're not the first ones to do this. Look at verses 6 through 11. Now, it was the custom at the festival, referring to Passover, to release a prisoner whom the people requested. A man called Barabbas was in prison with the insurrectionists who had committed murder in the uprising. If we were to write this today, we would have used the word terrorist. The crowd came up and asked Pilate to do for them what he usually did, which was to release a prisoner. Of course, we're not told which prisoner they have in mind at this moment. And so Pilate sees a window. "Oh, do you want me to release to you the king of the Jews?" asked Pilate. You see him lobbying? Knowing that it was out of self-interest that the chief priests had handed Jesus over to him, it almost seems like Pilate is now going to play the mob against the Sanhedrin, because he knows their motives stink and they have no case. So, I know, let's present him to the crowd, and surely they will select Jesus for the presidential pardon. Don't you think? This is a no-brainer. This case is terrible. This way, I don't have to be responsible. And so he says, "Do you want me to release for you the king of the Jews?" Now look what happens. But the chief priests stirred up the crowd to have Pilate release Barabbas instead. Can you imagine what that looked like? I think Pilate thought this was his way out. He'd appeal to the crowd. Certainly they'll select Jesus for the pardon. But the maneuver did not work. He was shocked. The crowd chose Barabbas. Now, incidentally, there's another bit of irony here that's worth mentioning here. Look at the word Barabbas, the name. Is there anything in there you recognize? Son of Abbas, or Abba, father. It means father's son. And so the crowd chooses to set free a father's son who is clearly a terrorist and demand the blood of the divine father's divine son in his place. So Pilate tries another means of avoiding what he knows to be an unjust execution, Mark 15:15a. Wanting to satisfy the crowd, Pilate released Barabbas to them, much as he didn't want to. He had Jesus flogged. Now, when we're reading this account, that usually just blows right by our minds, and we don't dwell on that at all. And again, we're looking at how Jesus responds to unfair, unjust, unrighteous treatment. This is worth looking at. A Roman flagellum, or flagrum, looked like this. It consisted of a wooden handle to which leather straps were attached. Now, in some photos I've seen, there are actually like big marbles or ball bearings put on the straps to give them weight. Now, the straps are also laden and tipped with bits of sharp bone and sharp metal and glass. And there is a reason why these floggings were known as the 40 stripes minus one, because it was just deemed so inhumane to go all the way to 40. And most scholars believe that Jesus got the 39. Now, one scholar says this: scourging with a flagellum was a vicious thing, ripping the flesh right down to the bone, causing severe bleeding. It was a beating from which many prisoners often died. There was an interesting progression, a sort of computer graphic kind of thing that showed the progression from one lash on through the 39 or the 40. And it's not a photo, so don't get weirded out by this, but it just shows the progression. You see what the back looked like after, what does it say, 6 lashes? What's the next one? 6 lashes would have been affected this way. Next one, 17 lashes is this. Look what 40 lashes look like. Yet we just gloss over it. It doesn't sink in. The one who made leper's skin fresh and clean is having his skin brutally lacerated and ripped off his back. The one who speaks words of healing and forgiveness to people is having words of unjust condemnation spoken about him. The one who speaks true words that are meant to give life is having lying words intended to bring death spoken about him. And yet he opens not his mouth. Pilate was amazed. The apostles, as they aged, those that lived, were amazed. And elderly Peter wrote about it. He said, when they hurled their insults at him, he did not retaliate. That's all we do today. We clap back. We tweet out something in response. When they hurled their insults at him, he didn't retaliate. When he suffered, he made no threats. Instead, he entrusted himself to the one who judges justly. So finally, Pilate's out of options, and he acquiesces, and he hands Jesus over to the soldiers to be crucified. Do you feel for Pilate at all? He tried, to a degree. But here's the deal. Pilate's handling of Jesus seems to have come down in the end to matters of expediency rather than justice. Ultimately, it came down to what would be best for his political career by keeping the Jews appeased. Do you feel that kind of tension in your life at all? At moments, you do what's expedient rather than what you know is the right thing to do? Then don't be too harsh on Pilate, because you do the same thing. So he's in the hands of the Roman cohort now. We won't read this. I just want to read a couple of sentences written by Charles Spurgeon in closing that talk about Jesus now in the hands of the Roman soldiers as they wind up to crucify him. Spurgeon said this in his sermon on the passage. See that scarlet robe? It's a contemptuous imitation of the imperial purple that a king wears. See above all that crown on his head? It has rubies in it, but the rubies are composed of his own blood, forced from his blessed temples by the cruel thorns. See, they pay him homage, but the homage is their own filthy spittle, which runs down his cheeks. They bow the knee before him, but it's only in mockery. They salute him with the cry, "Hail, King of the Jews," but it's done in scorn. Was there ever a grief like his? Is there ever an injustice to equate with the injustice borne by the Son of God? And you can't deal with your own unfair treatment? I just offer it out there for us to learn what we can from it.